Hi, and welcome to our first video in our series on human anatomy and physiology. This first unit will be on some introductory concepts and terminology, and in this specific lesson, I'm going to go over the levels of organization as well as some important regional terminology that pertains to the human body. Here at Guided Biology, we like to try to make a lot of these complicated concepts as simple and easy to understand as possible. And in that endeavor, I also have available in my shop, and I will link it down below in the description, some resources if you think they might be helpful. The first are these kind of follow along notes. These will allow you, if you want to take notes on the video. It contains the same images and space for you to write down notes as you're watching. You can use them on an iPad like I do, or you can just print them and write them by hand, whatever you prefer. So those are available. And then we also have these worksheets available where you can practice some of the different terms, labeling pictures, and it comes with the answer key as well. So those are available in our shop. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started on going over some of this terminology. Okay, so in our series on anatomy and physiology, it seems appropriate to very first go over the terms anatomy and physiology themselves. Okay, so anatomy is a term that refers to structures. All right, so with human anatomy, we're talking about structures like organs, the brain, the heart, the stomach, but also they could be a lot smaller structures like, what cells are found in the stomach, lining the stomach, right? What tissues are there, right? What is the shape of the stomach? What does it look like? Okay, all of that is going to be anatomy. So with anatomy, think structure. All right. With physiology, you should be thinking about function. Okay. So this is a study of the processes, right? How these different organs work, how they complete their different functions. So the stomach, for example, has an important function we'll talk about in a much later unit on digestion, right? So it's important for digesting proteins, okay? So for the physiology of the stomach, you would learn about how the stomach digests proteins. What enzymes does it make, all right? How do those enzymes work? Stuff like that, okay? What receptors are in the stomach that detects the presence of proteins, all right? So all of that is physiology, okay? And so it is important to keep in mind that these two concepts, anatomy and physiology, are very strongly linked. All right, so the structure of an organ, right, determines its function. Okay, so an organ really can't function properly unless it has its specific structure. So these are linked, and whenever possible in this unit on anatomy and physiology, I will point out kind of those links, and it should make logical sense why an organ is structured in a certain way, why it has certain cells and certain tissues as it relates to the function. And so we can make those connections as we go. All right, so those are our first two most basic terms. And so next we're going to start going through our levels of organization. Okay, and so these just help us to kind of organize the different things that we're going to look at for our anatomy, right, our structures. We're going to start with our kind of smallest possible structure in the human body and work up our way to our largest, kind of broadest category of structures. Okay, and this actually will be as we go on to later units for our anatomy and physiology series. We will talk about kind of these individually. So we'll talk about, some chemistry, and we'll talk about cells and then tissues and stuff like that. Okay, so this is kind of how this whole series is going to be organized. All right, so our very smallest kind of unit of structure in the human body is going to be the atom level of organization here. Okay, and so for each of these, we're going to write down a definition, and we'll talk about a few examples for each. Okay, so for the atom level of organization, by definition, this is the smallest unit of matter. And some examples for this that we see here, we have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These are three of the most common atoms that you will see in the human body. There will be a lot of other ones, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Really, if you think of a periodic table of elements, anything that is on that periodic table would be considered a type of atom. All right, so our next category is going to be the molecular or molecule level of organization. All right, so our definition for this is a molecule is two or more atoms put together to form kind of a larger structure, right? So they're bonded together. And we have some examples here. I have right here, Right here I have an example of a type of fat you will learn about that is called a phospholipid. So we'll just keep it very general now because we'll get into all these details in a different unit, right? So this is just a type of fat, right? We have here this big, large branching kind of blue structure. That is a type of carbohydrate called a starch, right? So this is a carb. And then here, this big blobby blue and purple structure, that is a type of protein you'll learn about called hemoglobin. Okay, so usually at this point in our unit or our big, series on anatomy and physiology, we're kind of keeping these things simple. We will get into them in a lot more detail later. For the molecule section, I usually point out the major types of kind of organic molecules. We have carbohydrates, we have fats, we have proteins. The only one not shown here is nucleic acids, so our DNA and our RNA. All right, so those are our major categories, and then we can get into all the specific examples as we get to those sections. All right, our next level of organization up, this is the organelle level of organization. So by definition, these are structures in a cell that have a very specific function. Okay, and so as I said, we'll go through most of these when we go into our cell chapter, just to highlight the ones I have here. So we have kind of everybody's favorite organelle, the mitochondria, right? The powerhouse of the cell, as everybody knows from, grade school. They learn, that's the first thing they learn about the cell, right? This green blob here with the purple spots on it, that's going to be our rough ER, endoplasmic reticulum. And here, these little pink blobs are supposed to be lysosomes. So lysosomes help to digest things in the cell. Right? There's lots of other organelles. So we have the nucleus, which is really important, centrioles, Golgi apparatus. So we'll get to all of those as well. All right, our next level of organization, that is going to be the cellular level of organization. All right, so just as a definition for this level, this is the basic unit of life, right? So kind of the smallest unit of life is it just a single cell. Okay, and these can be used to build living things. All right, and with our cellular level of organization, I always like to point out kind of a little hint that sometimes will help you know if you're looking at a cell versus, something else like a tissue or, something larger or smaller, is this ending. So if you see a word that ends in cyte, C-Y-T-E, then that is definitely a type of cell. Okay, so not all cells end in cyte, but if you see a term that ends in cyte, then that is going to be a specific type of cell. So one example is going to be an osteocyte. So we will see this in our bone chapter, right? So osteocyte, all right? So cyte tells you that you're looking at a cell, and then osteo, which comes first, tells you that you're looking at a bone cell. Okay, and so here in this picture, we have another example. So this would be a myocyte. So myo means muscle. All right, so this is a muscle cell. All right, here we have a red blood cell, which is also called an erythrocyte. You'll learn that later. All right, so again, you have that cyte. Okay, and then we have a neuron here. So no cyte in the name neuron. All right, but that is just a single cell is a neuron. And then here we have epithelial cells, so we'll learn about those as well. Okay, So those are some examples of cells. If you see site, you're definitely looking at a cell. All right, so let's move on to our next level of organization. All right, so next we have our tissue level of organization. Right? And by definition, a tissue is a group of cells working together for a specific function. Right, and so for now, we'll just keep it simple, and I'm going to point out the 4 major categories of tissues, and I have 3 examples here. All right, so the 4 major categories are epithelial tissues. So we have an example here. These are tissues that cover surfaces and line kind of the inside of the body. Like the skin is a really good example of an epithelial tissue, right? The tissue that makes up the surface of the skin. Okay, so we have our epithelial tissues, then we have a very large category called connective tissues, and then we have our muscle tissues, and then the one not shown here is nervous tissue, so found in the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so those are 4 major categories of tissues. We will have a whole unit on tissues, so we'll talk all about them. All right, so next we are going to go through our organ level of organization. So with organs, by definition, this is a structure made up of different types of tissues that are going to be working together to perform a specific function. Right, and most people know several examples of organs. I think this is the most well-known kind of level of organization. So we could label here we have our brain, nice and recognizable. All right, and then this kind of triangular organ here is the liver. So that would be an organ. And then we, of course, have the heart right here. And we have a kidney here. Right, and then maybe the slightly less recognizable, all right, thyroid gland here in yellow. So these are all organs. I think most people have at least heard of these organs, but they can get a little tricky at exam time with this organ level of organization, because you have to remember that if you have more than one type of tissue working together, that is technically an organ. So if you talk about like a specific bone, like the femur, right? That bone is made up of bone tissue, but it also contains lots of blood vessels. It has a connective tissue covering. It has nerves, right? So there's a lot of other tissues involved with that whole bone, the femur. So the femur would be an organ. Right, and the same goes with like a whole muscle. So if we're talking about the muscle in your upper arm called the biceps brachii, right, that specific muscle is an organ, because not only does it contain the muscle tissue, it also has lots of blood vessels. It has connective tissues that surround that muscle in a bunch of different layers. It has the tendons that are connected to it. There are nerves connected to it. So lots of different tissues. So that is also an organ. Okay, so remember, it's not just kind of the organs you think about, but whole bones, right, by name, right? The named bones would be organs, and the named muscles would also be organs. Okay, so that can be a little tricky at test time, so look out for that. All right, and then we get to organ system. I think this is the easiest one to identify, if it belongs to this level of organization. So for our definition first, an organ system contains multiple organs working together to perform a specific function. Okay, so our definitions are getting a little repetitive now, all right? We're always working towards a specific function. Right, and what makes this the easiest to recognize, kind of the members of this level of organization, is that these terms all end in system, so some sort of system. Okay, so we'll use our examples here. So here we have an example of the respiratory system, right? The digestive system, the lymphatic system, you have the endocrine system, and you can go on and on. Anything that has the word system connected to it is going to be part of the organ system level of organization. Okay, so it keeps it nice and simple. All right. And then lastly, we've built up all of our different levels to our final level of organization, and that is the organism level of organization. Okay, so let's do our definition really quick, which is nice and brief. So this is just a complete living being. All right, and in this class, obviously, or this series, we're talking about human anatomy and physiology. So we are going to focus on specifically the human as our organism, but there are lots and lots of organisms. There are insects, there's fish, jellyfish, reptiles, all other kinds of mammals, your cats, your dogs, plants, right? All of these are organisms. You can even have single cell organisms. If you take like a microbiology class, you'll learn about lots of those as well. Okay, but specifically, we are very focused on the human as our specific organism. All right, so now we are going to move on to our last section for this video. Right, in this final section, we're going to start looking at the human body and kind of how it's organized and some things are arranged. We'll talk about terminology pertaining to different regions of the body. Okay, so before we do that, I want to talk about really quick anatomical position. Okay, and so whenever you're looking at illustrations in human anatomy and physiology, typically they are going to be in anatomical position. Okay, so it's important to understand what that is, what it means, and of course, why it matters. Why do we care at all? All right, so anatomical position, by definition, is just a standardized body position, and it looks just like this. Okay, so what are some key, very important features that are always consistent with anatomical position? All right, so the individual is standing upright, right? So they are standing, they're not laying down or sitting in a chair. Okay, so they're standing upright. They are face forward, right? Their head is not to the side. They are face forward. Their arms are down at their sides, and specifically their palms are forward, all right? So their palms are facing forward. Okay, their feet are going to be planted flat on the ground and forward as well, all right? Not off to the sides, okay? All right, and so why do we care? Why do we bother to point this out? That is, of course, always a valid question in this class, and I will try to give you guys reasoning as much as I can of why things are important. So it is important because it gives us kind of a shared reference point, okay? So if we're talking about, which we will do in another video, structures and where they're located relative to other structures, right? We need to know that the arm is going to be down at the side, right? And not, sticking up in the air, okay? So we can say, where one structure is relative to the other. We need to know that this individual is standing up and not laying on the ground so that we could say, the chin is above the belly button, right? If this person was laying on the ground, that would not be true. Okay, so having kind of a shared body position that we all understand, right? This individual is in anatomical position, so we can talk about kind of where things are located when they're in that position. Okay, so that's anatomical position. All right, so with that defined, let's start talking about our regional terms. So with anatomy and physiology, the very first unit, one of the first things you're going to do is go over these regional terms. And it is going to seem very tedious, especially if you don't like memorizing things, but it is essential for you to give yourself a really good foundation to build upon as we go through the chapters. All right, this may just seem like a list of terms and you're wondering, I'm never going to use these, but trust me, you will. You will encounter these terms in different ways all the time, right? Throughout this entire series on anatomy and physiology, we will be seeing these things again. Okay, so regional terms are just terms that pertain to a defined area of the body. I've tried to kind of color code these areas to make it kind of visually more explanatory, so you can kind of see where like the area starts and stops. All right, so they pertain to a certain area and all the structures kind of contained in that area. Okay, and so some of these terms will sound familiar. They're things you've heard before. Some of them maybe not, okay? But they're not referring to like a specific bone or something like that. They just might share, a name with a bone that's also in that region, okay? And that is why it is helpful to know these things. All right, so let's go through these regional terms and I'll point out kind of what they mean, where they're located, and we can talk about any important concepts related to them. Okay, so let's start here with the nasal region, right? So that is the nose. The nasal region is the nose. That's a pretty straightforward one. Everybody's, I think, heard nasal before. One you might not have heard before, this is the otic region, right? Otic refers to the ear, okay? So otic region is the ear. And then next we have the mental region. So mental refers to the chin, okay? And so I think that's pretty kind of odd, right? So a lot of people would think mental probably refers to like the forehead because you're thinking mental, like thinking using your brain, forehead, somewhere close to the brain at least, right? So the way I remember this, and I like to use this as an example, right? I think of for mental, and I'll put a picture up on the screen. I think of the statue called the Thinker, where it's the guy with his chin resting on his hand, right? And he's thinking, kind of that classic thinking pose. And so that's kind of how I remember thinking mental chin, right? That's how I connect those terms, okay? And I just give this example because the sillier your way of remembering something, a lot of times, the more likely it is to stick and actually help you remember it when you need it, okay? So it can be different for everybody. Each person has their own special way to remember certain terms, things that make sense to them, all right? But a lot of times the sillier, the better, all right? Or the more unusual or the more kind of visual, the better, okay? So mental means chin. Right, oral, I think, is a term people are pretty familiar with. All right, oral refers to the mouth region. Cervical, this is a good one I like to talk about. Cervical refers to the neck, right? So here in blue. Okay, and this is a good example of why it's really important to understand these regional terms. All right, so cervical is a word we are going to see a lot in a lot of different contexts. So when we talk about bones, the vertebrae in the neck are called the cervical vertebrae. Okay, when we get to the nervous system, the part of the spinal cord that goes through the neck is the cervical part of the spinal cord. Also, when we go through the lymphatic system, you'll learn about cervical lymph nodes that are located in the neck. Okay, so that way if you're on an exam and there's a question that talks about cervical lymph nodes, you'll see that term cervical say, well, I know at least that they're in the neck, right? That's a good place to start. So that's what I mean by these terms, these regional terms are kind of a foundation that we're going to build on, okay? So there's lots of different ways you will see these again, okay? And you will be glad that you learned them, even if you're not the most happy to be studying them right this moment, okay? So cervical refers to the neck. Right, pectoral, right? So everybody thinks of the pecs, right? The chest here in orange. Sternal is the breastbone, right here in the middle in red. So bone located there that kind of has a similar name would be the sternum, all right? So they kind of share a common name. Okay, and then we move down to the cubital region. Right, that is the kind of front of the elbow, like the crease of your elbow on the front. That is the cubital region. Right, and then we have the kind of large green area here. That is the abdominal region. And then we have the antebrachial region. Right, that's your forearm. Right, so antebrachial is the forearm, and kind of from the elbow down to the wrist. Okay. And then umbilical, right? We think of the umbilical cord, that is the belly button. And then palmar, all right, kind of tells you what it is in the name. That's the palm of your hand, okay? Good. And then we have the pollex. So it's kind of interesting, all right? The pollex is your just your thumb, okay? So for the fingers, they're called digits, right? The thumb and the big toe, we'll see in a minute, they both have their own special name, right? So pollex is for thumb, okay? And then the next series of words, terms, I like to spend a little bit more time on because I think they can get a little confusing. This happens sometimes because there's kind of overlapping regions, right, in the pelvic area, okay? So start with the largest region, all right? That's going to be the part in blue. So that's the pelvic region. That's this whole area here across kind of your pelvis. So just below the abdominal region, right? But just before your legs start. Okay, so the bottom of what we refer to as the torso. Okay, so the torso is kind of this like trunk of the body here. So if we refer to torso or the trunk of the body, that's this region, right? So it's where the neck and the arms and the legs all attach, right, to the torso. So the bottom of the torso here under the abdominal region, that is the pelvic region. Okay, and so then within the pelvic region, we have these kind of two medial regions here called the inguinal region. Those are kind of referred to as the groin. All right, and they sit on either side of this kind of orange area in the middle called the pubic region. Right, so that's where the genitals are located. Okay, so both of these, right, the inguinal region and the pubic region are located within the pelvic region. Okay, so it can get a little confusing because they're kind of, in overlapping areas. All right. Okay, continuing on down to the legs now, we have the femoral region, right? So that's kind of like the thigh, right? That's the femoral region. You probably know the bone located there is called the femur, okay? So they share some similar terminology. All right, and then moving on over, we have the patellar region. That is the knee here, the front of the knee. We'll see in a minute, the back of the knee has a different name. Okay, so that's the patellar region where the patella, the kneecap, is located. All right, and then the shin, right? So the kind of front lower part of your leg, right? The anterior or front lower part of your leg is called the crural region. And then your ankle, right? These are called your tarsals. And then, like I said, your big toe has its own special name as well. That is called the hallux. Okay, so the hallux is your big toe. All right, so now let's look at the regional terms on the back or posterior side of the body, and then I have some review questions that we can go over together, kind of learning the information we've talked about in this video. Okay. All right, so the posterior side of the body, let's start at the top again. All right, so the back of the head, this region in red here, is called the occipital region. All right, so there's a bone there called the occipital bone. Also, that region of the brain is called the occipital lobe. All right, so you'll see that term again. We have the scapular region, which is the shoulder blade here. So again, we have some overlapping areas here, right? So the shoulder blade kind of sits on top of the larger thoracic region here. Okay, so the thoracic region just refers to like the chest or the upper part of the torso. Right, so remember our abdominal region was below here and then pelvic below that. Right, so the thoracic region is here, kind of the top part of the torso. Okay, so we have our larger thoracic region with that scapular area kind of sitting on top of it over the shoulder blade. Right, the acromial region, that is kind of the point of your shoulder. So the way, if we're like in lab class together, the way I point out is if you bend your hand up to just kind of touch, like your left hand to touch your left shoulder, right? That kind of part that you can reach is the acromial region, right? The tip of your shoulder, kind of the little outer edge of your shoulder. All right, coming down from there, we have the brachial region. So that's the upper part of your arm. Good. This is another good example of something you will see many, many times, right? So brachial with muscles, we see, biceps brachii is in this area. The brachialis is in this area. There's a brachial nerve. There's brachial blood vessels. All right. So that's a good term to know. We're referring to the upper part of the arm. All right. We'll move over this way. The axillary region, that is your armpit. So axillary is the armpit. Like I told you, the front of the elbow, remember we said was the cubital, right? That crease. The back has its own special name. That's the olecranon region, right? So that's the back of the elbow, the pointy part of your elbow. Okay. Running down, right, the middle of your back, that is the vertebral region. So that's kind of like the spine, right? So your spine, that's the vertebral region. You can see that here in purple. And that ends here at the base at this region called the sacral region, right? So the sacral region is like the base of the spine. There is a bone there called the sacrum, right? There's also a sacral part of the spinal cord. You'll see that term later, okay? We come over here, we have the carpal region that is referring to your wrist, all right? So the carpal region is your wrist. And then we have our coxal region here, all right? So coxal refers to, so a lot of times in the book, it's defined as just like the hips. So specifically, right, it's kind of the outer part of the hips. So, if you put your hands on your hips, right, like you're frustrated with someone, put your hands on your hips or you're waiting, right? That part that your hands are on, that is your coxal region. Okay, so not like a larger area, or that's the pelvic region we already talked about. Okay, the coxal region is just the side of your hips. We would say like the lateral side of your hips, which we'll get into those directional terms in another video. Okay, and then we have the gluteal region, right? That is the buttocks, right? So the gluteus maximus muscle is located there. As I mentioned before, aside from your thumb, which is the pollex, your other fingers, that's the digital region, right? This also refers to the toes as well, aside from your big toe, which is the hallux. Okay, so digital, these are your fingers and your toes. And then when we said the patellar region was the front of the knee, I mentioned the back of the knee had a separate term, and that is the popliteal region. Okay, so patellar on the front where the kneecap is, the back or the crease of the knee, that is the popliteal region. The back of your lower leg, right, that is the sural region, right? So the front is the crural and the back is the sural. They kind of rhyme, right? So they rhyme, and also C alphabetically comes before S. So the C crural is on the front, S sural is on the back, right? So that's your calf. Okay, and we have our calcaneal region. Okay, calcaneal is just the heel of your foot, right? So that back kind of heel of your foot. And then plantar refers to kind of the rest of the bottom of your foot. Okay, so it kind of is equivalent to like the palm of your hand, but on your foot, right? So kind of the bridge of your foot leading up to your toes. Okay, good. So those are all of our regional terms. Now, let's go through some of these practice questions. So I put these here just to kind of give you an idea of how commonly, in anatomy classes, this information is asked in a question form. So going back to our levels of organization first, right, what you could be asked, right, is maybe you could be given an example of something that belongs to these levels, and you will have to say what level it belongs to. So this first question, chondrocytes belong to what level of organization? All right, so the first thing I do, I look chondrocytes. Are there any hints? And I gave you guys the big hint, right? Cyte refers to a cell, all right? So you don't have to know what kind of cell it is. You don't have to know what chondro means. You just have to see cyte and know, hey, that's a cell. So it's going to belong to the cellular level of organization. Okay, our next question. All right, so in addition to, being given an example and you have to name the level it belongs to, you could also be asked to give an example of something that belongs to a specific level, or in this case, I've done a multiple choice question. All right, so which is an example of the molecule level of organization? All right, so we look through these. We know nitrogen, that's on the element, the periodic element, the periodic table of elements. All right, so that is going to be the atom level, so that's a no. All right, we know a ribosome, or we are going to learn soon with our cell chapter, a ribosome is an organelle, so that would not belong to the molecule level. Starch, that's something in food, right? So it's a nutrient, so that does sound like a molecule. But let's look at our last one, right? Monocyte, well, that has cyte in it, so that's going to be a cell, so that's not right, okay? So definitely it is going to be starch, right? So starch is a type of carbohydrate. Okay, good. All right, so now using some of our regional terminology. So the regional term calcaneal refers to the blank. So this is a very simple, straightforward way to ask your understanding of these regional terms. Okay, so calcaneal refers to the heel, right? So, or the heel of the foot, if you want to, have a more explanatory answer, right? So it's the heel. Remember this region right here. All right. Or you can be asked kind of the other way around, okay? You can be given a definition and you have to give the regional term. So what regional term refers to the base of the skull? Okay, and so we can see here it's the occipital region. All right, so for this one, it is occipital. Okay. All right, great job on getting through your first lesson in Human Anatomy and Physiology. Please stay tuned for lesson 2. We're going to be going over some more terms, directional terms, sectional terms, body cavities, all of that fun stuff. All right, so stay tuned for lesson 2. And please check out our resources in the description box for the fillable notes and the worksheets to help you study this material. And I will talk to you guys next time. Bye.